I don't spend much time paying attention to or worrying about guys like Matt and Walsh, any of those MAGA chuds, those professional troglodytes. They're uninteresting, right? They are just transmission points for the latest bit of pro-Trump propaganda, and I just have better things to do with my time. I got things to read, things to watch, better things to do with my time than pay attention to these people and get mad at them for the things that they say, since their whole job is to say things that will make people mad in order to attract more attention for themselves. No use engaging in any of it. Even if they have these large platforms, even if they're influential in some way, I can't do anything about that. So my perspective is, why bother? I'm going to speak to the people and pay attention to the people who I think are putting value out into the world. Of course, there are times when these people, when guys like Walsh, say things that are so revealing, so illustrative of larger attitudes happening in the MAGA movement that I do pay a little bit of attention to them. And so that's all throat clearing to say that Matt Walsh said something on X that I thought was genuinely interesting. Not a sentence I'm going to say very much in the future, maybe the only time I'll ever utter it, but it was genuinely interesting. I'm going to read it for you. I'm as reflexively non-interventionist as anyone can possibly be, but Venezuela appears to be a resounding victory in one of the most brilliant military operations in American history. Quick note, come on. As an unapologetic American chauvinist, I want America to rule over this hemisphere and exert its power for the good of our people. If some shitty little tin pot third world dictator is harming our country or interfering with our national interests, we should do exactly what Trump did to Maduro. Why not? International law is fake and gay. The only international law is that big and powerful countries get to do what they want. It has been that way since the dawn of civilization. It will always be that way. And we are the most powerful country on the planet. It's about time that we start acting like it. Now, I think that this is basically the ideology when it comes to international affairs of the entire Trump administration. You saw Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, say something quite similar in a conversation with Jake Tapper this week.
The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony of Denmark? The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States.
Can I say real quick, not to be too mean, not to be too insulting, but can I say real quick, and this is going to relate to the broader point I make, trust me, but can I say real quick that Stephen Miller is a big blubbering piss baby?
Big blubbering piss baby.
Like, I know he puffs out his chest and tries to appear to be dominating and threatening and someone who's gonna, show you the business. But I listen to him talk, and again, he has state power. He's like a dangerous man. But I listen to him speak, I watch his body language, and I'm just sort of like, that's a piss baby. Anyway, I just had to get that out. I had to get that expression of contempt out. I'm sorry. That's just how I am. Back to the substantive point. So Walsh's statement that international law is gay, is feminine, is weak, is, I think, very reflective of the entire MAGA world. It's like part of the MAGA worldview. What I'm about to say is purely descriptive. It's not a moral judgment. I'm not making any normative claims. I'm just describing the world as it was. After the Second World War, the United States is quite literally on the top of the world, the largest and most powerful nation on the planet, one that escaped the devastation and the carnage of the war largely unscathed. And so what American elites did in the wake of the war was construct international organizations, international relationships, rules, trade agreements, standards of conduct, all designed to solidify American power, to make American power indispensable to the operation of the global economy, of the global political world, to everything. This is part of the competition with the Soviet Union as well, but it was also done with an aim towards making the United States a true global hegemon. You can name the institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, et cetera, et cetera. You can think about the relationships, NATO, our relationship with the UK, part of NATO, but also kind of a separate thing. You can think about the ways the United States tried to exert its influence in the Middle East through its support of Israel, in Africa through its support of South Africa. Many elements to this, right? It's just part of the broader American attempt to make itself the indispensable global hegemon. And a large part of this was the projection of military force, the use of military force. Korea and Vietnam stand out as sort of the largest scale uses of military force during this period, but also the United States is flexing its muscles wherever it can. It's utilizing this network of institutions and relationships it's built to pursue often its most narrow interest. It's relying on the fact that everyone kind of has to rely on the United States to buck the rules that are set out for the rest of the world. So you have Americans deposing governments and leaders in Iran, in Vietnam, attempting it in Cuba, throughout Latin America, throwing its assistance behind brutal dictators who say they're going to act in some kind of American interest. All of these things. You have basically American imperialism backstopped by an entire network of global institutions and relationships. Now, the thing about this global order is it is rhetorically, at least, built on notions of reciprocity and equality among nations, right? The United States is part of a community of nations. It can't just break the rules. It breaks the rules all the time. The rules don't apply to it. But the rhetoric of American presidents and American leaders is that of international cooperation. That's the pretense. You could call it hypocrisy, but hypocrisy, as the aphorism goes, is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. And although much of the world grumbled about this hypocrisy, the United States was genuinely indispensable. It was the world's economic hub, the center of global finance, the dollar, the reserve currency. American military might crucial to securing free trade, right? All these things are the case. The United States was an indispensable nation. And so when it broke the rules, when it engaged in imperialistic ventures abroad, even when other states, other nations objected and complained, they still played ball because they had to play ball. From the perspective of American elites, this is almost the best of all worlds, right? You can do whatever you want, essentially, and the rest of the world is highly dependent on you. And because the relationships of dependency are so lucrative for everyone involved, the rest of the world isn't also that interested in trying to change the arrangement fundamentally, maybe on the margins, but for the most part, people accepted a world of dominant American power. And there was even more so after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the United States was sort of the world's lone superpower. Why did I bring all this up? So we have a global order, pre-Trump global order, that is rhetorically and perhaps ideologically built on notions of equality and reciprocity, on cultural exchange, on influence through peaceful ways. We know that in practice, those ways weren't so peaceful, and the United States did a lot of terrible things and caused a lot of misery. But rhetorically, at least, that is what it was built on. That was how American presidents spoke. George W. Bush did not speak about going to war in Iraq to secure oil supplies. He spoke about spreading democracy. And I'll say, as just a bit of a parenthetical, that they often believe this as well. People's motivations aren't as clear-cut and material as I think some analysis would present them. People, including the leaders of superpowers, are a bundle of motivations, and decision-making at that high level isn't always so clear-cut. It may not even be entirely rational. That's scary to think about, but it is the case. The current situation in the United States is, I think, abundant evidence that it is the case. So we have this rhetorical commitment to freedom, equality, democracy, all these things. We have the actual behavior of the United States, and there's an obvious contradiction there. We also have the failures of the past 2 decades, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global financial crisis, and so on and so forth. I think like guys for Matt Walsh, for Stephen Miller, for Donald Trump, for the entire MAGA right, they look at the rhetoric and they say, oh, that was the basis for American power. They ignore the networks of institutions and relationships. They ignore the actual dynamics happening in terms of America's relationships with the rest of the world. They focus on the rhetoric. And that rhetoric to them reads as weak, as feminine, as Walsh said, gay. And so in power, their aim is to dismantle the institutions and relationships that rhetoric was used to justify. They don't see what we see, which is a United States that can largely operate with impunity, but does so within certain rhetorical and ideological limits. What they see is the United States restrained by notions of fairness and reciprocity and democracy and all these things. They look to someone like Vladimir Putin and they admire that kind of no pretense, no hypocrisy, might makes right, the strong do what they want. Now here's the turn. Behind all of this is a vision of masculinity, a vision of what it means to be a man. It's no accident that all of this is happening at the same time as what seems to be a society-wide gender panic, both here and abroad, especially in the UK, over the existence of transgender people. Tons of gender anxiety happening everywhere. And I think all these things are connected. We can go back to Walsh. The only international law is that big and powerful countries get to do what they want. This is a vision of manhood, of maleness as masculinity, as domination. Big countries dominate small. Strong countries dominate weak. Men dominate women and children. Heterosexual men dominate gay men and trans men. And this is tied up in notions of race and race hierarchy as well. Whites dominate everyone else. White men are at the top of the hierarchy. But gender is the key thing here. Masculinity as the domination of other people and things is the key thing here. An international system in which the United States pays lip service to notions of reciprocity and equality and et cetera, reads as weak, reads as feminine. Real men don't negotiate with people. Real men don't have discussions. Real men beat and pummel their opponents and take what they want. International law, here's Walsh again, is gay. It's like it's pure text. That's what I love it. It's pure text. There is no subtext here. Subtext is for cowards.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
Trump and all of these guys look back to the 19th century, look back to the age of great power competition and naked conquest because it makes their dicks hard. And they hate the current era of international cooperation as much as it exists because it makes your dicks soft. That's basically it. That's what's happening here. Maybe I'm simplifying things a little bit, but that's basically what is happening here. Now, the last thing I'll say here, well, the last two things I'll say here, is that you can't separate any of this from the actual identities of the men involved. I mentioned that Stephen Miller is a big blubbering piss baby. Matt Walsh isn't some kind of prize of traditional masculinity either. Certainly Donald Trump is not. These are people, I'm going to add Pete Hegseth as well. These are people clearly struggling to reconcile their actual selves with the idea of masculinity they hold in their heads. And they can't do it. They lash out. And they lash out by showing the world that they can dominate. They lash out by performing the kind of masculinity they think is true and real. Of course, Stephen Miller is a big blubbering piss baby. What other kind of person would behave like that? The final point is that it's not an accident that some of the key men in this orbit, including the President of the United States, have credibly been accused of sexual assault.
We begin tonight with the list of women who have now come forward accusing Donald Trump of inappropriate conduct. The detailed claims right here. And they come after that video, Donald Trump on that bus describing what he's able to do to women, kissing them, grabbing them, because of his fame.
Because the ideology here, the vision of the world here, is the vision of a rapist, is the vision of someone who sees other people as merely things for them to use, who actualizes themselves through the domination of others in the most violent and crude ways. That is the ethos they want to bring to the world stage. The US not as partner to the rest of the world, as flawed as we often are, but the US as something like the neighborhood rapist.